Reality
Check.
Podcast.
It's exactly 15 minutes past 12 on this Tuesday afternoon, and President Biden, he's announced that US forces will be ending their combat mission in Iraq by the end of this year. There are 2,500 US troops in the country helping Iraqi forces against Islamic State group fighters. So why make this move now, especially after the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan seems to have backfired there? Steve Curley asked Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist.
Last year, the Americans assassinated a very senior Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, and the leader of a Shia militia backed by Iran in Iraq. And that absolutely outraged much of the Iraqi political class, including the prime minister. And lots of political parties, including the ruling party, said all American forces have to go, even though they helped to defeat ISIS over the last 5 or 6 years, even though ISIS remains a threat. And really the politics changed. Sort of the pro-Iran factions, and some others as well, were really angry at this American action and turned against the United States.
We know what happened in Afghanistan with the announcement of the troop withdrawal there. Are there parallels with the Afghanistan situation here in Iraq?
Not at the moment. In Afghanistan, of course, the Taliban have taken over half the country since the announced departure of American troops, and they have, encircled cities, they have threatened provincial capitals, and there's a real chance the government in Kabul might fall. That's not really a problem for the moment in Iraq. It's not like 2014. The Americans left in 2011 after the Iraq War, but then in 2014 they had to rush back to help push Islamic State away from major cities and turn the tide. That isn't going to happen at the moment. Islamic State is severely weakened, and Iraqi forces are much better than they were a decade ago, back in 2011. So there's no risk of national collapse. But certainly, I think the Americans leaving, the end of their intelligence, the end of their support, a lot of that is going to weaken Iraq, and it's going to put a lot more pressure on the Iraqi forces. And I think it's inevitable Islamic State is going to make some gains.
The next question is, how stable is Iraq now as we go into the latter part of 2021?
It's relatively stable in military terms. Of course, the same underlying conditions that gave rise to Islamic State, which is lots of Sunni Iraqis, Sunnis, of course, being the sect of Islam that is the minority in Iraq. Shias are the majority. Many Sunnis felt they were being unfairly treated by the central government and by Shias. And that sense of grievance led them to, in some cases, tolerate or cooperate with ISIS sweeping across the country. That grievance hasn't gone away. Iraqi politics is still dominated by Shia parties, many of them very close to Iran's government next door. So those underlying risks are still there. But there's a democracy, it's just about works. The country is moderately stable. There are, of course, huge problems in terms of healthcare, power, electricity, the economy, jobs. Those are huge issues. There's a lot of frustration. We saw big protests in Iraq, of course, a year and a half, 2 years ago over those issues. Security situation is not sort of perfect. There are still bombings, there are still attacks. But, it's not a patch on the situation that existed perhaps 10 years ago when the Americans had to come in.
FM4 Reality Check.
It is Tuesday afternoon right now, and getting access to vaccines remains the greatest challenge that developing countries face when it comes to protecting their citizens in the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa and India, with the backing of many other countries, continue to push for a temporary waiver of patents on COVID vaccines and other treatments. And today, the humanitarian organisation MSF has renewed its call for the World Trade Organization, which is holding a high-level meeting today, to stop blocking such a move. To find out more, Joanna Bostock spoke to Markus Bachmann from MSF Austria.
Doctors Without Borders is supporting the proposal of the governments of South Africa and India to waive the TRIPS-related protection of intellectual property rights for COVID tools. This includes vaccines, medicines, diagnostics, as well as, for example, ventilators to save people's lives.
But this is a controversial subject because the pharmaceutical companies and others say it's not that simple. You can't simply give people the recipe and they can then build the vaccines. There's a lot of complicated technology transfer involved.
I think there's also a lot of myth involved. Myth claiming that countries in the global south, low and middle income countries, do not have the technologies, the know-how to produce quality medicines and vaccines. This is no longer true. There is a big mismatch between production capacities and actually the number of doses produced. And the main obstacle in between are the intellectual property rights in the hands of a few pharmaceutical companies.
What about the challenge of vaccine hesitancy? Because in Africa, I understand in many countries, this is a huge problem. So in a sense, if people aren't going to take the vaccine, isn't it more important to tackle vaccine hesitancy at the same time?
The contrary, the lack of vaccines is contributing to a hesitancy. We also need to remember in our own countries, in Austria, with the growing access to vaccines, the hesitancy was actually decreasing. And the same we see now in countries of the global south with hardly any vaccines available at hand. The more people see that vaccinations are safe, that they are not harming people, that there is very limited adverse effects, the more it will contribute to overcome vaccine hesitancy.
Can you give us a general overview of the status of vaccinations in African countries?
I have come back from Nigeria, where I have seen that 4 million doses have been shipped to the country at the beginning of March. All of them have been used to vaccinate the population. It's enough to cover about 1.5% of the population. And this is true for the whole continent. About 61 million doses have been so far administered on the African continent out of 3.9 billion doses worldwide. So only a handful of doses is going to the 55 countries on the African continent, while billions of doses are prioritized for populations in the global north.
Joanna Bostock speaking to Markus Bachmann from MSF Austria there. And you can re-listen to all of our pieces on our website in the Reality Check podcast section. And indeed, listen to the entire show in the player fm4.orf.at.
FM4 Reality Check.